All right, let's get going. Welcome everyone to SSI Toronto, the second meetup in our series of meetups. My name is Mathieu Glaude. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Northern Block. For those who don't know Northern Block, we're a Toronto-based consulting firm that focuses on blockchain and identity solutions. And we've been, like I said, this is our second meetup, and we're really focused on growing a community around self-sovereign identity. So we came about self-sovereign identity trying to solve identity issues within our own solutions, where as we're just developing decentralized solutions, there's always been a gap in identity, which ends up centralizing the solutions altogether, which doesn't solve all these privacy and security problems that exist today. And so this is very important to us. And in the current landscape where people are more and more aware of they not having really any more privacy altogether, and all these security issues that are happening where every week we're hearing about a new cybersecurity breach. Um, a new way of doing things is needed, and having ownership of one owns data is really the key for the future here of taking back our privacy and ensuring we have security. Um, to make this happen, we need to be using distributed technologies, which is where blockchain comes in, which is how we got involved into this. And the key to any distributed or decentralized technologies is having cooperation between different parties, which means that a strong community of advocates is needed to partner together and build up these foundational platforms. And so knowledge is really key, and we think that we're fortunate enough every day to be working with this stuff, so we really want to be sharing it with the rest of the community here. If anyone wants to find more information about this event or this topic, you could find our meetup event on meetup.com under SSI Toronto. You could find information on Northern Block's Twitter account, which you just search Northern Block Twitter and you will find that. You could also send us an email at info@northernblock.ca, and we'll be glad to start a conversation with you. So the first event we did last month was quite successful. Our CTO, Dave McKay, gave a great presentation on the basics of self-sovereign identity. The event was very well received. It was well attended at our offices in Toronto. But with the global situation happening here, we thought the responsible thing to do would be shifting these events for the time being to online events, just for everyone's safety. But I guess the good thing about that is that there's a lot of folks that are not necessarily based in Toronto that are able to join these events. And I see a bunch of them online today. So welcome everyone that's outside of Toronto that is able to attend. We hope you really enjoy this event today, and we really think you will. And so the agenda today is we have two speakers. The first speaker is Tim Bouma, who is a senior policy analyst for the Government of Canada's Chief Information Officer branch. So Tim is all over the digital identity space. He has a great podcast about digital identity, which you could find. He's very active on Twitter, so go find him there as well if you want to interact with him. So his name's Tim Bouma. Tim's a key contributor to the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, which is a collaborative effort with the private sector to develop a standards-based approach to digital identity for all Canadians. So Tim will be given a brief presentation to kick off the meeting, which we're quite excited for. And then we're welcoming our main speaker today, Drummond Reed from Evernym. So Drummond Reed is the Chief Trust Officer for Evernym. Drummond's a thought leader in the digital identity space. He's been around the space for over 20 years. So we're quite excited to hear him give a brief overview of self-sovereign identity and what he thinks are really the top use cases or business cases for self-sovereign identity in the near future. So looking forward to this whole presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and hope you enjoy the content ahead. Thank you.
I'm just going to be sharing some of the figures that we have in our Pan-Canadian Trust Framework document, and just to give you a visual of things that you can look at. Can you actually see the slide right now?
Yeah, we could see it, Tim. Thank you.
Okay. And it's 6:08. I promise to keep my remarks to 10 minutes or less, but I'm pretty excited because we just put the finishing touches on the use case chapter for the self-sovereign identity book that Drummond will be talking a little bit later. And the title of the chapter is Canada Enabling Self-Sovereign Identity. And it's quite substantive. We've got about 10 or 12 pages of content here. And I'll just kind of walk you through some of the things that we've been going through in the Canadian public sector and just relating it back to this product that you're seeing on the screen, the PCTF model. Um, so where do I start here? We've been looking at self-sovereign identity. We've been looking at it for a long time in terms of what the technologies are, what the model is, and things are still evolving. Like in the early days of identity management, we had more of a program-centric point of view, but we've shifted it to a user-centric point of view, and now we're moving to like a self-sovereign point of view. And we've learned a lot over the years, if not the decades, to come up with a policy approach or a pan-Canadian approach that doesn't necessarily lock us into any particular technology. And in fact, when we started in earnest on the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, self-sovereign identity wasn't even a term that existed yet. It might have existed in certain quarters, but it was certainly something that we weren't aware of. But started to become familiar with the concepts, and really followed closely with what Drummond has been doing and the self-sovereign community, and actively ingesting those concepts into the pan Canadian Trust Framework. The other thing that we've actually taken a lot of attention to is that because we're the public sector, we have a lot of these legacy systems, the centralized systems, the federated systems. They're not going to go away anytime soon. And we actually have to come up with an approach that actually synthesizes that together so those systems can actually come together. And this is where we're at, like with what we've been calling the public sector profile of the Pan Canadian Trust Framework. It's really a model of agreed on concepts, definitions of processes, conformance criteria, and an equal part to it is an assessment approach that enables us to do a detailed assessment of other jurisdictions. It could be other sectors, so we can actually accept trusted digital identities. That's the other thing that's happened behind the scenes, so to speak, is that actively with the government of Canada over the past 10 years, I guess it was 2009, we introduced our first policy instrument, the Directive on Identity Management. And we revised that in 2019, 10 years later. And we added some new concepts like trusted digital identity and trust frameworks that really have set us up to actually accept self-sovereign identity or trusted digital identity. And so we've been taking those ideas and making sure it actually fits within to the policy framework that we've been developing, so we can actually be ready for the future and not be locked into the past. And it is proving itself out. You may not be aware. As of February 10th, have the province of BC integrated into the federal programs. It's within Canada Revenue Agency. We also have Alberta that's integrated into the My Service Canada account. We're accepting the trusted digital identities. It's traditional legacy integrations that I talked about earlier, but we're setting the stage for enabling digital wallets and the notion of self-sovereign identity, so an individual can present their trusted digital identity that we can consume as a federal government. So, we've been conceptualizing so we can actually fit this together. The block diagram here, and I can point you to that. We have this all up on GitHub, and so you can read. We have all the formal definitions and that. But just to go through what we're calling the normative core of the model is that we formally define what we call identity domains, foundational identity, and contextual identity. We formalize this notion of digital representations, identity of individuals and organizations, businesses. We're looking at relationships. We defined a whole bunch of processes, which are atomic processes. That's really the detailed, enable us to do the conformity assessments, and then dependencies on other organizations or other jurisdictions. And that can be applied against what we call the conformance criteria and qualifiers. It's really a conformity assessment framework, but now we have the ability to do the due diligence to accept a province as an issuer of claims, if you will, to use some of the lingo and self-sovereign identity. And quite frankly, digital identity or trusted digital identity is just a very specific use case of the more broader case of verifiable credentials and self-sovereign identity. The other part is that we have the mutual recognition process, which we go through to actually going from the bottom to the top, mapping the processes, aligning it to other frameworks. We're starting to have conversations with EIDAS and what we call the digital nations, other countries, so we can actually start mutual recognition, have a formal assessment and acceptance process. At the bottom part, you'll see this notion of digital ecosystem roles and supporting infrastructure. We know that this has to work with existing investments and existing infrastructure, and also has to fit into like institutional frameworks. And so we've spent a lot of effort. I'm going to the next slide of formally defining. If you're familiar with the W3C model of verifiable credentials and self-sovereign identity, you're probably familiar with issuer, holder, and verifier. We've really mapped that out to the notion of subject and claims. And then we've added another box on the bottom, which we're calling methods. What we've learned is that you need to trust a system, if you will, that's more than just a single organization. It's more than a blockchain. It's more than a database. It's a set of methods where you can register and confirm, but also make sure that everything is correct and nothing has been changed. And I just wanted to show that. So we found that we can actually take this model and we can map like authoritative parties, relying parties, service providers. We do have a mapping in the trust framework. And just I have 4 minutes left. I'm just being very mindful of the time here. The other thing that we've learned as well is that we're making a clear separation between what I would call what we've been calling the conveyance networks, those things that actually convey the proofs, versus those that issue and verify the proofs. So we now are starting to see a very clean separation of now we know where the infrastructure players can fit in. And it doesn't really matter whether it's centralized, federated, or blockchain, or completely decentralized. We know how to box those things in the middle, if you will, to actually convey the proofs. Where our primary concern is making sure that whatever gets issued onto that network, we actually trust in the first place, and then when it gets verified, it hasn't changed since. So we have a nice, clear separation now. We've also just been working with Drummond to make sure that we're mapping with the notion of the trust over IP stack, the 4 layers. And this is where we've mapped like the model of the PCTF, the normative core, the mutual recognition, really sits at the layer of governance frameworks. It's not a formal governance framework per se. When you put it into the larger picture of legislation and regulation and formal agreements between jurisdictions, kind of fits a little bit below there, but it actually fits in very nicely there. The layer 3, the credential exchange, basically that's the digital ecosystem roles, and Drummond will be talking about a little bit later. And then the whole thing about DIDCOM and DID registries really fits into the notion of supporting infrastructure. And again, not directly within the scope of the PCTF, but we see the huge potential of these emerging technologies. But we also see that we actually have to support traditional like SAML integration, OpenID connections, OpenID Connect. So we're just making sure that we can actually migrate to the new platforms without like burning the old platforms down. Supporting infrastructure, I think this is the last slide here. We know that this has to fit into a larger context of making sure we meet our digital service delivery requirements, user needs, so on and so forth. We're not reinventing privacy and security. We already have a privacy impact assessments, security assessment authorization, and also interoperability standards. We know that there's a bunch of interoperability standards out there. We're not redefining those things. We're actually leveraging that. And again, coming back to the province of BC doing the assessment process, that was only one of 8 work streams that were involved in actually onboarding a province. There was also communications, there was agreements, there was a privacy impact assessment, the technical integration, the security assessment. There was an overall governance stream. But this just shows how everything fits together. So I know it's a bit of a mile of a minute here, but I think coming back to the chapter that we had written, I'll just read some of the statements that we came up. We said trust frameworks such as PCTF and self-sovereign identity are parts of a larger global picture. Domestically and internationally, there is a new and emerging global ecosystem incorporating a mixture of new technologies and legacy systems. And it is anticipated that these technologies and approaches will coexist for the foreseeable future. As I said, we have assessed and accepted from the province of Alberta and the province of BC. There were traditional integration methods, but we certainly see how we could actually integrate what's called like the Alberta Credential Ecosystem, and also the British Columbia Verifiable Organizations Network. And there's some other stuff that BC is doing as well in Ontario and globally as well. So really, we're actively pursuing SSI. It's still too early to predict the future. That's one thing that we've learned. We've got to keep our options open as much as possible. And the PCTF, what you saw here, is really a tool to help relate SSI into the government context and to drive, like, what's really hard is the institutional change to better serve Canadians. Really, the hard part is dealing with all the legal folks and the policy folks, and you don't see that on the surface, but that's where a lot of the hard work is. And really, we see this actually encouraging like new institutional relationships that can leverage self-sovereign identity. And if we do it right, it's going to become pervasive, and it's just going to create a better digital ecosystem. So I'll leave it at that. I was 1 minute over, and I will hand the screen
Thank you,
over, and
Tim.
away we go.
Thank you, Tim. Much apprecited. Where could folks find you or find out about the Pan Canadian Trust Framework?
Yep. What we could do, if you look on my Twitter account, I actually have a pinned tweet that will bring you to the GitHub repo. That's probably the best way to find it. And feel free to reach out to me. Quite happy to point you to the stuff. I'm trying to lever like blogs and GitHub and my podcast. So if you go to that, you'll find some pinned tweets on, or you'll send tweets on my I think it's on my profile where you can get with Apple and Google and so on and so forth. So lots of info, and feel free to reach out to me if there's anything that specific that you need.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
You're
Thanks,
welcome.
Tim.